Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to Church History 2. Today we're going to talk a little bit about death, purgatory and masses, and humanism. We're going to cover quite a bit in a short amount of time. And I want to start out with reflecting on the 14th century plague, the Black Death, that wiped out about 1/3 to in some areas, half of the population in Europe. You have to think about that this is taking place in the kind of 1300s, and the plague resurges year after year or decade after decade, so that the church is surrounded by death. In that period, these kind of memento mori, these reminders of death, were all around them. Here's a famous church, the Church of the Innocents in Paris. This is painted during that time of kind of the Black Death, or represents that. And in the kind of side here, this cloister area, and here's a closer look, you see all of the skulls and bones. They were part of this structure. And in the archways there, you see the Toten dance, the death dance. That became this popular theme in the 14th century. People lived with death all around them. It was something they couldn't control. Here's a popular image of the Toten dance. And what you see is, you see death in this kind of skeletal figure, bringing all people from all different castes of society to death. Nobody escapes death. So the monk doesn't escape death. The cardinal does not escape death. The old man does not, right? And neither does the young child escape death. All of these are not spared. Here's the rich man being led to death, and the poor pilgrimage person, the traveler, the nun, and the queen. All of these never escape death. The knight here, here's this monument, this kind of tomb figure, where they show the knight above in his armor, but below a representation, sculpture of the decaying body. No one escapes death, and these monuments of death, the memento mori, surrounded 14th century and 15th century culture. Here's another one of those monuments. These statues reminding people of the decay of death that spares no one. During this time, the art of dying, the ars of moriendi literature, started to develop. And so these small books with these prints would talk about the temptations towards death, and the vices and the virtues, trying to kind of help people in some ways imagine a way of dying well, because no one escapes death. And they were done in these different little pamphlets that would represent different vices and different virtues. I will post another video that talks a little bit more about the ars moriendi, so you can learn more about it. During this time, Christ was seen as judge, as legislator, primarily. He was still seen as the Redeemer, but primarily as a new lawmaker. So you had the Old Testament law, and what Christ has done is he's made the law even harder, right? So you have said, do not commit adultery, but I say unto you that whoever looks towards another in lust has committed adultery. And so there's a kind of heightening of the law that Christ has set out. And to follow Christ's law made Christ a judge figure. And that was heightened during this period. Here you see this kind of painting that was kind of above the choir area of an altar in England. And you see Christ above here as a judge, as a lawmaker. And you see people dying, these kind of last days. You see the wicked being eaten by death. And this image was a popular image of the end times, of kind of of hell, of people being saved from hell and the resurrection of the dead. These became connected to kind of their theology of death and worship, because the Mass became a way to kind of try and have some control over death. In the Mass, which is also kind of the Eucharist, the ascended divine Lord still participates in fleshly life through bread and wine on the altar. So there's this connection between heaven and earth in the Eucharist. And people are taking it less frequently out of reverence. They take communion only out of one kind. They only take the bread and not the wine, because it can get spilt, or as McCulloch says, it might be left in someone's mustache, and that can desecrate the blood of Christ. So a lot of care was taken over this rite, this worship rite of the Mass. But at the same time, these prayers and this offering was seen as something that could help the dead. And so what happens is that guilds, tradespersons that would be united as a group, started funding separate altars or chapels within churches, and funding a priest to say prayers, do masses for those who had died in and who are waiting in purgatory. So this is the great time kind of in the 12th, 13th, 14th century where purgatory as a theological doctrine also become really relevant, because people are seeing death all around them. Purgatory is this kind of holding period where you are purged from your sins and your wrongs in life, so you can be prepared for heaven. Now, in saying a Mass for someone who's dead, you're taking time away from their time in purgatory. And so what happens is you have people starting to pay for priests to say Mass for their dead loved ones. This becomes really, really common. In fact, Henry VII, he left a provision in his will for 10,000 soul masses. So he paid enough money for chapels and priests to say 10,000 masses for him while he's in purgatory. Why? Because he wants to get out of purgatory quicker. Everybody wants to do that. So you have this really interesting relationship around death taking place in the late Middle Ages. It's associated with purgatory. It's associated with these mass deaths of the plague. And then you have this association with what can you do? You can pray for the dead, and actually maybe people in purgatory that have spare time can pray for you as well. So this really intricate economy around the dead is being developed. And Luther is going to butt heads with this, because what develops out of this is also a theology of indulgences. Indulgences were a way that you could pay for an indulgence and help somebody along in purgatory. Now, the money for that would be used for kind of church work, building of chapels, different ministries, and then the benefit would be that a person can get a loved one, out of purgatory sooner. This is based out of a theology of kind of the merits of Christ, or also kind of a concept called the treasury of merit that the church had access to. What that means to say is that Christ and the saints had done so many good works, right? A superabundance of good works that can be shared with other people. And that could be shared through this concept of an indulgence. You pay, I'll take out of my treasury some additional extra good works, give that to you. That helps somebody in purgatory with less time. It's a complicated theology, but it's part of this economy around death and worship that's really intricate. And like I said, most reformers butt heads with this in the 16th century. At the same time, you have the rise of kind of of humanism, this Renaissance movement of theology, history, education, the arts, and architecture. All of a sudden, in around the kind of 14th and 15th centuries, people were looking at the Roman Pantheon, this amazing building that was built by the ancients. And they were saying, how did they build that? How come we cannot build buildings like this? And so there was this carrion call, this cry, ad fontes, back to the sources. Let's renew society by looking at the past and see how they do this. And this is one example in architecture. Erasmus was a leader in this movement. He unearthed some letters, and you read one, Vala's letter about the donation of Constantine. This document that said the kind of land there in Italy that the church owned was donated by Constantine in the 4th century. But what is seen by Lorenzo Valla is that actually the document that was being used to support the ownership of this land was a forgery. It had anachronisms. It was referring to things that the people in the 4th century could not have known. And so this is a returning to the source. This is kind of where historical criticism develops and textual criticism develops. Erasmus starts looking at his Latin Bible, and then he starts reading the Greek texts. And he's seeing that there's problems in translation, and there's problems in the text. So he creates a Greek New Testament that's printed. And that's another thing that's really kind of fascinating. Here's an image of it. You have Latin in one column, here according to Luke, and the Greek in another. He's helping people return to kind of these early texts, the critical texts, and that becomes revolutionary. If it weren't for this, the reformers wouldn't have this kind of sola scriptura emphasis. They're going back to Greek. They're learning Greek, they're learning Hebrew because of this humanist movement, okay? And it's really profound. Also, Erasmus, as a humanist, he writes this work in Praise of Folly, where there's a lot of criticism around the morality of church leaders, of monks, and bishops and popes. There's more trust in church councils, what is seen as conciliarism, versus kind of the authority of the Pope and its bishops. And so this is a movement of kind of, let's return back to the sources. It's where our authority should lie, and a challenge of the status quo that, in Erasmus's view, the church is extremely immoral and loose in its practices. All of this at the same time is taking place with the revolutionary technology of the printing press that allows for the writings of Erasmus and Luther and others to be published and distributed broadly. This becomes the context of the Reformation. This kind of theology and economy around death, and this return to the sources, a challenge towards kind of traditional authority, a looking at texts for truth. All of this with the printing press made for the explosion that is the Reformation in the 16th century. And we'll look more into that later. But for now, blessings and peace.